Okay. Although I think that you can hear me anyway, whether or not this is on, but it's not too loud. I would like to thank the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives for providing us with this space and sponsoring this discussion. And also our old friend Tashi Tsering of the Amni Machen Institute, who has also agreed to co-sponsor and to introduce the discussion. And I thank you all for coming, and I apologize for the late starting time. It was actually more difficult than I thought to get a cab down from McLeod Ganj, and I'm sure those of you who are here now know how horrible the weather is, and it was really, it's really very kind of you to come here. Tashi has introduced certain aspects of modernity, and I guess since this is a discussion with all sorts of different sorts of views, I should start off by saying that there really is no one definition of modernity, and people sometimes talk about modernities, that maybe there are different kinds of modernities, but the question still remains, how do we define it? And what do we mean by it? This, I think, is actually a really interesting conversation. I should lay out some ground rules at the beginning. First of all, the three of us here are all friends. So don't believe it when you hear me, you know, screaming "Et tu, Brute" in the midst of the discussion. And we have different views, and I thought it would be a good idea, you know, if we just discuss them, because there's so many different ideas about modernity all over that it might be a good thing to talk about. The other thing is that the whole question of modernity, I think, is a really fraught one for Tibetans. And that is to say that one of the arguments that was made when Tibet was attacked by China, and later when it was incorporated into the People's Republic of China, was just how unmodern, how backward Tibet was. And there were many apologists who would say, you know, Tibet did not even produce, what is it, a pin. They couldn't even manufacture a pin. That it's a medieval society, and that it had to be brought into the modern world. And if you look at some of the writings from the 1950s and 60s, you can look at Anna Louise Strong and Stuart and Roma Gelder, somehow there is this idea of, oh, Tibet is not modern. Now, I have to say, when I talk about modernity here, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm trying to talk about an historical process. There are many societies that are quite modern, or that have been quite modern in the 20th century, that have done horrible things. So to start off, I'm not equating modernity with good, lack of modernity with bad. I want to talk about this dispassionately. So, but again, as I say, this is something that I think does concern Tibetans, because the whole question of whether Tibet was modern or not has sometimes been used to argue in favor of China's place in Tibet. So here I'm taking away value judgments about good or bad. And again, I should also add, having said that, there are some societies which are unquestionably modern that in the 20th century did horrible things. And there are some societies that we could say were unquestionably not modern that did not do horrible things, and maybe did some very nice things, some very good things. So I just want to take away this idea that modernity equals good and a lack of modernity equals bad. Now, I'm going to basically introduce some arguments I made in an article that is not yet out. It's actually still in press with Rożnik Orientalisticzny from Warsaw, which I do believe the library has. I do believe the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives receives a Rożnik Orientalisticzny. Yes? Oh.
I was confused.
Oh.
So it's not published, but they have it.
Well,
you have the journal.
Yeah, they received the journal, but not this issue, because this issue is still at the press. And so it actually began when I was discussing some things with Federica. And I said, well, you know, I have this little thing which, you know, is going into press. And I sent it to her. And she said, you know, I have some disagreements with you. And I said, well, since we're both going to be in Dharamsala, why don't we just open it up for discussion? Because again, as I say, this whole question of modernity is something which I think engages Tibetans. And then I said, well, let's make it just a broad discussion. And when I say a broad discussion, I'm going to have my say, my two friends will have their say, and I hope that there are people here with things that they want to add too. And it's not a fight, it's a discussion. And, and Federica and I have talked about some of these things, but I've also said, no, let's not, don't tell me that. Let's wait till we get to the round table. And then I also invited Dr. Roberto Vitali, my very good friend, who I know has so many other things that he could do more profitably on a Friday afternoon with texts and with all sorts of other endeavors. And he's been very, very kind he's been very, very kind to agree to come here and also to take issue with some of the things in the article that I wrote. So. Without much further ado, let me just introduce the ideas that I had set forth. This comes from an article that, as I said, is forthcoming, and it's about the Miwang Tokcha. I've been looking at the Miwang Tokcha most recently, and about Miwang Pola, who is an extremely important figure in Tibetan history. I think most of you probably know Miwang Pola. At the last talk I gave, there was a question about Gyurme Namgyal, so I guess the Pola family is reasonably well known. And I titled the article, The Rise of the Great Man, Tibetan Secular Biography in the Advent of the Modern. And of course, that's very problematic because I'm already using the term modern in the title. And again, the question now is, well, what do we mean by modern? And I have to say that I do not say in the article that Tibet had a modern society in the 18th century. What I do say is that the appearance of the Miwang Tokcha in conjunction with a number of other factors is indicative to me of the presence in Tibet of what one might call sprouts or roots of modernity. That is, the ground is being set. There is a setting of the ground that had Tibetan history gone otherwise, might have produced those things that we generally characterize as modern. Now, what I find interesting about the Miwang Tokcha, it's a massive biography. It's a massive, massive biography, and it is a biography of a secular man. It is not your what one might expect in Tibetan biography, the Namtar, in which the person is praised for his spiritual achievements, for having converted or tamed, if you will, so many important people, for the list of disciples that the person has, for gathering so many people for teachings, etc., etc., etc. Miwang Pola, and this is a biography from the 18th century, Miwang Pola is praised in the biography for his heroism, his military exploits, for his recognition by the Qing emperor and the receipt of titles from the Qing. These are, if you will, very secular activities. And I also posit that Miwang Pola was very much a part of the Qing Manchu-Mongol order. And indeed, I've said elsewhere that the period from the time of the 5th Dalai Lama up until the mid and even later portion of the 18th century constitute, for me, Tibet's second Mongol century, the first being the period during the Great Mongol World Empire. So Miwang Pola was very much a part of this Manchu-Mongol order. The Mongols were extremely important in Tibet, the Khoshot in particular, or I should say the Western Mongols, the Oirat Mongols. And this was, none of these things exist in isolation. This is a period in which the British are seeping into India, the Russians are seeping into Siberia, and the world is changing. The world is changing in a direction towards things that we might recognize as modern. Again, I have to say, I'm not making a value judgment about this. But at the end of the 17th century, when the Qing representatives met with the Russian representatives to demarcate the boundary between the Qing realms of the Manchu emperors and the realms of the Russian emperor, the Kangxi emperor was absolutely stunned at the kind of maps that the Russians brought with them. This sort of map-making abilities or facilities that existed at the time were unknown to Kangxi, and he immediately set out to have the Jesuits, and you know there were Jesuits at the Qing court just as there were Jesuits at the Mughal court, very important. He immediately set out to have the Jesuits teach these map-making skills. This is the beginning of a, how shall we say, a different spatial perspective, a modern spatial perspective in the world, which ultimately comes to include Tibet. Ultimately, Tibet is also mapped into this large imperial map in the 18th century. As the Manchu Empire is extending itself into Tibet, Tibet is also mapped. Those maps, by the way, exist. They're in Chinese. The first map, yeah, I didn't know if there would be anything to project. I only brought one little projection, but we don't need to have it. I was going to show you what I think is the first modern Tibetan language map. It's not highly detailed. It's, you know, it's drawn, but the first map in the Tibetan language, which shows the continent of Asia in a way that we would recognize it as modern. And in fact, it is a modern map. It was done not too far from here, actually, in Kelang, by the Moravian missionaries in 1865.
The wise maps.
The what?
The wise maps.
No. No, this is, it's in a text which is held by the Field Museum, which I've never seen reprinted anywhere. 1865. It has the Sachem Sewe Melon. Okay, so this, you know, this is part of the argument that I was making. And other things I find extremely interesting about this period. One of the elements of quote-unquote modernity that people talk about is the different sense of self, the appearance of autobiography, you know, interrogating oneself in a way that is somewhat different from the Rangnam, again, that you have in Tibet. It's a much different sort of self. And the interesting thing for me is that we have now a secular autobiography. The Miwang Tokcha is a biography. The author is Dokar Shaptung Tsering Wangyal. Dokar Shaptung Tsering Wangyal then writes his own autobiography, the Kalun Tokcha. And it's much shorter, but it is a secular autobiography after having written a massive secular biography. And I have to say also, some people will say, well, you know, what about the Situ Kachem of Changchub Gyaltsen or this or that? When I start to talk about things that may have set the ground for a possible modernity in Tibet, I also have to say that it was not just one element, this or that, but the entirety of the situation, the appearance of the Miwang Tokcha, the Manchu-Mongol order that was starting to deal with the West, Tibet, the British coming into India, and British goods being traded in Tibet, the Russians in Siberia dealing with the Qing. All of these things, I think, set the ground for what might have been. And in addition to the autobiography, you also have the appearance of a literary form that many people say is symptomatic of modernity, the novel. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, all these things center on one person, Dokar Shaptung Tsering Wangyal. He writes the Miwang Tokcha, he writes the Kalun Tokcha, and then he writes Shunadame, which some people say is the first Tibetan novel. So there is something which I think is going on in terms of world changes, something happening in Tibet, which I think sets the stage for what one might call the roots. The roots. Now, changes do not happen, you know, overnight. I forget, there's a famous quote from the Bloomsbury Group on December something, 1900, something, something, the world changed. I forget who said that, but of course things don't happen like that. Changes in society and world history, trends move by fits and starts. Sometimes a little root here, then it disappears, then something else, then it disappears. The development of a kind of secular, this sort of secular rule and the praising, this literary monument that praises a man of great martial abilities. What I find interesting about it is it happens right smack in the middle of Ganden Pojang. Right, we already have the establishment of Ganden Pojang and the government of the Dalai Lamas. And then in the middle of that, the beginning, in the first half of the 18th century, you have power in Tibet taken by somebody who is secular, who is not a Lama. It becomes the most important person in Tibet and is a man with martial accomplishments. So if sometimes, something appears, then it disappears, then there's a little trace of it here, and a little trace of it there. I closed my article by posing the question, these things leave, once something like this happens, it opens the gate, as it were, for something which may not occur again for another century or whatever, but there's a kind of precedent for it. And I asked whether this might not be what resonates during the time of the 13th Dalai Lama. As many of you know, when the Tibetan military, Tibet began to construct a modern military. I use the term modern here, how should I say, just to avoid all sorts of extensive explanations. But as you know, a military that was trained in Japanese and English, the English manner, all of a sudden, the military began to demand representation in Tibetan society equivalent to that of other sectors of society. And this led to, of course, the lowering of Tsarong's position. It was a very, very interesting period. And I say, is this not something that resonates, perhaps, with the introduction of a kind of secular figure as the most important figure in Tibet in the early 18th century? Anyway, my two friends take issue with this, and I think some of you may also take issue with it. And that's why I would like to have an intellectual discussion of the matter, friendly intellectual discussion with the matter. So you can hear me pleading with both Robbie and Federica when I say friendly discussion. But no, actually this is the way it should be. They both have certain differences of opinion, and I have to say, again, there's no one definition of modernity, and this also is very, very problematic. And having put out my ideas like this, I really would like to rethink the issue. This is one of the nice things, I've finished my teaching career, and one of the nice things in a university, once you get tenure, if your students ask you something, and they say, no, shouldn't it be that? Since you have tenure, they can't fire you. So you can actually say, yeah, maybe I'm wrong, and not get fired. And now I've retired, so I have no job to lose. So I'm really happy to have two good friends here to point out things which they think I have either overlooked or have not given due consideration to, or points about which I may be wrong. And I'm very happy to reconsider these. And in fact, if I may say so, it was my idea to do this. So, and I'm not a masochist generally, so I think that this will be beneficial for everybody. So, who would like to go first?
Ladies first. Yes.
Well, I would also like to thank the Library of Tibetan Work and Archives, and I think my voice carries enough.
Oh.
And Tashi Tserin for having us here tonight, and also all of you for braving the weather, which was not kind today. I have some substantial disagreements with Elliot's idea about modernity. First of all, he doesn't quite give an exact definition of what he thinks that modern is. And even though I'm not one to attach to these ideas of exact definitions, I think in this case it's needed. What I can find in his article, he talks about a modern order that emerges in the larger world about.
Yeah,
just one at a time. I see. And he has mentioned this already by talking about the arrival of the English in India, the arrival of the Russians in Central Asia, and sort of some of their more modern ideas somehow seeping into Tibet. What he talks about also is the advent of trade, of a large network of international trade that sort of put Tibet in the middle of a world of a sort of a trade globalization in a sense, and I would disagree that with the idea that trade and modernity necessarily go together, and we talked about this already the other day, because if you talk about goods, say, from India, he mentions, from England, he mentions French broadcloth being traded in Tibet in the 18th century, as mentioned by George Bogle, and other items like from the Armenian merchant Hovhannes Yugayetsi, who brought in spyglasses and such things which were clearly sought after. Well, then we would have international trade during the Roman Empire too. But would we call that modern? So I wouldn't. You would have international trade during the Mongol War. You would have international trade during the Persian Empire. We have Gandharan art, which is highly influenced by, of course, classical art. So are we talking about modernity? Was that modern? So I would disagree with that. So what I tried to do was trying to find a definition of modernity. I also disagree with the idea of talking about modernities. I strongly believe that humans are all the same, and that as a consequence that we should apply the same measure, the same standard to everybody. So we cannot have a modernity that works for Europeans and a different modernity that works for Asians, and a different other for Africans and so on. We need to find a standard that can be applied to everybody. And I think that can be done by looking at how societies, how humanity developed. If you look at tribes, for example, at very primitive society, in tribal society, the tribe was a unit that included, comprehended 4 different sets. The tribe was both the political unity, was both the economic unity, the religious unity, and the social unity. So everything was included in the tribe: politics, economics, society, and religion or ideology was all done in one bundle. Once civilizations developed, then you begin to have a separation of this bundle. And what you have is normally religion and politics tend to bundle together. Think about all the European kings that were whose power derived from God, the Holy Roman Empire and all of that. And then you had also, and then you have instead economy and society go together. The economy is bound to the society, to the way the society works, to the way traders and families exchange goods, and the farmer sells his goods to the artisan that makes baskets or whatever. So when you begin to have a more advanced civilization, then you have politics and religion on one side, and economy and society on the other. They separate in that way. As you advance toward modernity, these 4, let's call them atoms of the molecule, they become even more separated. So you have politics on one end, religion on another, economy and society, they're completely separated. And there's a sort of constant tension between them, so that, we struggle not to make them touch each other. And that's what you have really in modern societies. If we think, for example, of, and then I'll stop here and let Robbie talk, because I don't want to keep too long. If you think, for example, of, say, a household, the typical household in a traditional society contains everything. It becomes sort of the basic economic unit, It's a political unit because it's the household, it's a census unit. Think about the Mongol census in Tibet that counted only the households. It's a working unit. All the family works together. They have a business. It can be farming. It can be husbandry. It can be a shop. They all work together. In modern society, the household doesn't work together anymore. Your father cannot tell you who you're going to marry. Your father cannot tell you who you're going to vote for. Your father cannot tell you who you are, what you're going to believe in. I come from a Catholic family. My parents cannot tell me to be Catholic. I can choose whatever I want. So it becomes everything. That's sort of my example of why you have religion, politics, economy, and they cannot tell you to do the same job. You know, if your family is of shopkeepers, and you don't want to be a shopkeeper, you're not going to do it. But in traditional society, that's exactly what happens. So that's why I would disagree that Tibet was having was putting some roots of modernity. I agree that the Miwang Tokje is an exceptional development at the time, but I think it's an isolated development. And in fact, I would say also the first novel, the Shou No Dame, how long does it take before another novel comes up in Tibet? You don't see any more for a long, long, long time. And so it's an isolated development, and it's not really something that I see as a basis for something. It takes a long time to actually arrive at this separation of the atoms of politics and religion, society and economy. And I think in many cases, we don't have this, even now in many countries. So that's my basic objection.
Actually, Elliot and I never really spoke about modernity, and I never really spoke about the article you wrote. He sent me his article a couple of days ago, and I'm not here to criticize his article at all. That's his view. I like to elaborate a few concepts about modernity, with a tiny bit of skepticism from my part, if I refer modernity to the Tibetan culture and to the Tibetan traditions. Before doing that, thank you, Tashi. Thank you, LTWA, for asking me to come today. So, what I find in the concept of modernity, a good amount of Inji perspective. I mean to say, I think modernity is an Inji yardstick. I wonder whether this Inji yardstick should be applied to different cultures, especially the Tibetan one. I am an Inji, of course. That's very obvious. But I feel slightly reluctant to impose my yardstick on other cultures. So, this is my first reluctance, especially these days when Tibetan studies have taken a direction by which we see that the Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan culture, is more and more used by researchers as a container, as a box, in which Inji conceptual formulations are stored. So I consider myself a traditionalist, in a way, you know? So I'm definitely not a modernist. If modernism is to take these ideas, you know, these concepts of the tradition, isolate some fragments of the stream of the Tibetan knowledge and culture, and serve the purpose of other conceptual formulations, I don't think this is perfectly fine. So this is the first reluctance I have vis-à-vis the word modernity, and I feel that it is a typical Inji concept. But there is another aspect of this ancient yardstick of modernity which worries me a little bit, is that the historical perspective, if we see modernity and we try to think of modernity in terms of judging the past and the flow of this tradition from our viewpoint, I think we are using a wrong historical yardstick, you see. I think the yardstick should be consonant to the period in which certain expressions were formulated or developed. So, altogether, I find that modernity is a word which worries me quite much. I would also consider the fact that in different cultures, and this I disagree with you, Federica, so I'm disagreeing with everyone. I don't think that if we think of modernity as advancements or changes, I don't think they are synchronic. When you say there is one concept of modernity, I think there are zillions concepts of modernity. Maybe in greatest, dawn of civilization, the invention of the wheel was an amazing form of modernity, which we give for granted. So, what I mean to say is, different cultures had different advancements and not at the same time. So there is this kind of pluralism in human civilization which cannot be reduced to a single concept. Right. So if I think about modernity, then I must say, for instance, that Tibet in the 9th century, in the time of Rinpoche, was much more modern than Europe, the cradle of technology in some form, because in the 9th century, Rinpoche was building iron bridges, and in Europe, iron bridges were initiated only some 600 years later. Or if I think about, the great mathematicians and geographers from Islam, who came to work along the Mediterranean Sea all the way to Spain, they were far away, far more advanced than anyone else in their times, when probably, Europe was struggling with medieval superstitions, this and that. But now we see Islamic culture as rearguard in comparison with others. So that's what I mean to say. I mean, there are innovations, there are changes, they are perfect. I'm fine with them. I also feeling completely bad about the idea that the modernity was. You wrote this in the article. Columbus, 1492. The discovery of the New World, in my view, it was something like he wanted to go elsewhere and ended up somewhere he didn't know. It is a little bit if I want to go to Mumbai and I ended up going to reaching Calcutta. This is what? Is this the beginning of modernity?
If you realize you've reached Calcutta instead of Mumbai, maybe.
So that's what I mean. You see, I have all these. I think they are topical innovations which are very much embodied in certain moments of human civilization. And I also feel that they are perennial innovations. When I think about Galilei, for example, who said that the world is round, it's not flat, this is absolute modernity in my view, you see. It's changed everything, right? And there was no coming back from there. Or think about Einstein and his theory of relativity, which has blasted our brain, We still don't understand what it is, but we all love it, you see. It's wonderful. So that's what I'm trying to say. I am skeptical. At the best, I like to talk about innovations, and modernity, I leave it aside. Okay? So, if there are certain connotations about, I may be long. You forgive me for that.
No, I'm taking notes.
Don't write
it's quite
too
useful.
much. Don't write too much. So, one typical point you have been telling about that Federica has been stressing is the separation between secularism and religion. Okay. I feel that Tibet had this situation for centuries, maybe my complete, concoction and all. But I feel that in the long run, there were secular powers in Tibet for centuries and centuries, where, you know, secular activities were pursued, side by side with religion very important. But there was no need of a seizure in the same way as Italian Renaissance did, when a group of shrewd traders finally managed to create a civilization which tried to stay away from religion, or putting religion slightly to a more corner. So I feel that if we talk about literature, we have definitely non-religious works and genres as well. I'm thinking about Dunrab, for instance. I'm thinking about Runze. And I also think about great masterpieces of Tibetan literature, like Situ Kachem, written by a monk, but this is definitely a political treatise. And this is definitely centuries before Miwampola. Right. So, another point which makes alleged modernity was the opening to the outside. Right. So, in importing ideas from wherever they could come. I personally feel that ancestral Tibetan culture was formed by the adoption of foreign aspects of civilization on the plateau. Right. I mean, from China, from Central Asia, and other sources. The combination, the mingling of this material, together with the mingling of the ethnic groups, created not only the Tibetan race, but also a culture which we only suspect existed. And so probably could have been and was quite different from what we know about present time Tibet. Because if you think, at that time, you see sedentary people, I mean the Shimba, took over the nomads. And so the situation of a world, which was the Central Asian steppes, I mean nomadism and this, was put on the back foot in comparison with, you know, this different vision of not based on moving from one territory to the other, horses, pastoralism, and all that. But not only this. For instance, you know, one person, one great Tibetan of the past, who has been often blamed for being rearguard, right-wing, or whatever, Lalame She, if one reads his kashoks, his edicts, he stresses the point that in his kingdom, every possible novelty coming from outside the borders should be studied, adopted, and re-elaborated. This is modernism, and we are at the end of the 10th century. So he searched from innovations. Even the concept of takop yu, right? The idea that Tibet is nothing else than a barbarian country is the Tibetan approach throughout the centuries to open up to other ideas. I mean, the famous competitions in levitation between Padam Pasangye and Milarepa.
I'm taking it in. I'm not looking quizzically. But I think you should talk to the dogs. They seem to have a problem with what you're saying.
Of course, everyone has a problem with what I say. So if I have to have a great man, you know, I would go for other great men, Elliot. Miwampola, fine. He worked for Ganden Pochang, which I tend to define as a theocracy, right? Which is not exactly the epitome of modernism. Okay. He brought the Manchu to Lhasa. And this policy had devastating effects, for Tibet. I think about one of my heroes, and this is one of my heroes, Tukchen Ugyempa. Okay, a monk, of course, he was a monk, but we still don't know whether it was a Trukpa or a Karmapa, you see, which already shows well enough that he was someone independent, with an independent mind, independent thinking, right? So he opposed the Mongols in every possible form. The Yuan dynasty emissaries, the Sakyapa, burnt his monastery down. He was the Mongols tried to kidnap him 5 times, and he whipped the warriors and refused to go to the court. He eventually went to the court, met Sechen Gyalpo, and despised him entirely and left without giving any teachings to him. So if there is someone who has shown some dissent, some resistance towards the enemy, towards the occupier, it was U Gyalpo, who, if you allow me to say, when you talk about Zamling Geshe is not one of my favorite works. I'm sorry. I think about U Gyalpo.
I didn't write it, so...
No, fine, but you appreciate, you see. And
So Elliot Zamling Geshe was done by the Moravians, not the Temple Nongham.
not Lama Tsempo.
No, Elliot
No.
didn't say anything about Lama Tsempo.
No Lama Tsempo.
No, it was the Moravians in Kelon.
It's a Moravians.
Of the Moravian Zamling Geshe. Okay, fine. But anyway, I like to remind that U Gyalpo wrote an extraordinary treatise, which is missing, unfortunately, on the river systems originating in Tibet and flowing in other countries. Northwest India, the Gangetic Plain, China. We don't have it. We have only fragments, and it's an extraordinary piece of geographical work, you see, with greatest accuracy. So when I think about modernity in this my restrictive mind, I think of modernity here and now. And I think of modernity also, again, here and then. Right. So I would, if I have to speak about modernity, I like to speak about the present time. That's what I feel is modernity in a way, no? It's our day. So, I don't know, should I stop? Or? No, you please tell me.
If you have more critical
because
things to say, then yes, stop. But if you have nice things to say about me, please
No,
continue.
I'm not going to say anything about you anymore, Elliot.
No, continue, continue.
I'm just going to say something about, recent past and especially the future. Okay. So, I may sound banal, but if I have to find an epitome, a symbol of Tibetan modernity, I'm sorry, I'm using the same person. Who can I say? Gundun Chöpel. Right, I'm sorry to say, but it seems to me so obvious. But I think that Gundun Chöpel is exactly the person, a man who coming from the past and walking into the future. So he didn't care whether he was a monk or a layman. He just went beyond all this. He left it behind it, you see. There was no more this idea between secularism and religion, Chösi Sunzel or what, He did this work. So, and what is very interesting is that, of course, we know he opened himself to any idea innovation around him, practicing them. But this is the crucial point in my view, and this is where probably I disagree with you, Federica, that his fundamental concern was that he always put Tibetan culture as central to his work. He maybe co-opted these ideas around him, but he was a Tibetan who kept this point very clear in his mind. If one reads Serkitama, if one reads Debtar Karpo, his wonderful poetry and his IFC artworks, past and future went hand in hand. Okay, that's what I feel. So this is the modern Tibet I advocate. I advocate the centrality of Tibetan culture in secular terms, with a secular perspective, if I may. So keeping Tibetan traditions central, accompanied by opening to any intelligent and useful innovation. Civilizations like ancient Greece or ancient India were superior cultures, that's for sure. Greece enlightened the world around the country with plenty of insight in many fields. Ancient India colonized the conquerors, give them a culture, give them a civilization. I don't know whether Tibetan is a superior culture, but I know there is much to offer. It has a civilization features to offer to anyone genuinely interested. So I would say I would not try to waste it. But in doing this, I would wonder if we can leave something very distinctive in the mind of the Tibetan people, especially, in the diaspora. So the loss of Tibet is something distinctively concerning everyone, and it's definitely something absolutely irreparable. It's a concern which can never be forgotten. Is present in the Tibetan collective mind. So it's very difficult to come to terms with it. But I wonder, since we are here in Dharamsala, whether it is possible to look into the future too. Gedun Chöpel did so, and this is my view, it's Tibetan modernity. So when I say looking into the future, I talking about pursuing a vision. So people talk to me about the loss, but not about a vision for the future. Sometimes I ask my learned, intelligent, special friends, how would you see Tibet if Tibet will be free tomorrow or in 50 years? And what about the diaspora? So I don't know. I feel that I wonder whether Tibetans will be able, here in exile, to build a truly functioning society by laying down its pillars in the fields of economy, education, welfare, at least. The idea of working at an economy is not to make 5 Tibetans rich, but to legitimate everyone in the eyes of the outsiders. And this is something quite important in my view. I would see a university here in Lhasa, beside Sara, where true Tibetan culture and traditions with non-sectarian approach and a secular vision are taught in their original formulations to Tibetans and anyone around the world seriously interested in this. Perhaps with interdisciplinary references to other comparable civilizations. Not, if you excuse me, adulterated dharma for housewives in Ninja countries during the weekends. I would add to the LTWA museum a didactic museum which teaches the many expressions of Tibetan culture, given that our good friends, the Chinese, have destroyed everything, all specimens made in Tibet throughout the centuries. This would give a glimpse of what Tibet was, especially showing Tibetan cultural geography. I find that there is, when I ask about Tibetans, their provenance, sometimes they say, oh, I am from Yu, I am from San, but that's not enough. So I would see a center for the arts, where the new and the old are taught and practiced. I would give back the Lake Hospital to the Italians, my ex-fellow nationals, and tell them to bring here a state-of-the-art hospital. A hospital that, like the Lake, would be a scandal if built in Italy. So give Tibetans the chance to excel in any profession by acceding to education around the world with equal standards as everyone else. For instance, we just have a couple of filmmakers here, one is here, sitting in the back, and here in exile. Why not some talented youngsters sent to a movie school of some repute? So I wonder if it's possible at the same time to scratch the wall which is separating occupied Tibet from the diaspora. I just wonder whether it's possible to talk to the people up there, talk to the people as much as possible, exchanging ideas, changing words. Maybe it will be a first small step in trying to get together for a better future. In the late 9th century and early 10th century, when there were the Kenlock, the revolutions of the subject, something which has been used by the Chinese for their own propaganda, because they said that it was a kind of communist revolution, but that was not so. There were the great aristocratic clans reclaiming the lands they had occupied for centuries, their control, after the Lassetsempo dynasty collapsed. So the revolutions at that time were called revolutions of words. And I like to keep this in mind. So in order to stop pestering you with this, all these ideas, a slogan that could be good for the future of Tibet, for freedom to come, comes from the French Revolution of French Spring of 1968. And I would like to attach any factional value to this. When the student said, power to imagination, I think this could be also adopted by the Tibetans. You know, any constructive, engaging prospect for the future fits in. With this spirit, I would see modernity in Tibet. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. And I can say that I feel a sense of gratitude, because there's no greater appreciation that one can get than when people actually read what you've written and take so many notes and give you so many ideas and so many suggestions, because they've read it so carefully and they've taken what you've written seriously. So thank you. What I would like to do is I'd just like to say a few things in response, and then one more time maybe the two of you could respond to me, and then I would
maybe I can respond to you.
Well, I guess we'll all try and be brief, but then I would really like to open it up to all of you who are out there, because if I may borrow a page from Dr. Roberto Vitali, we're all Yinji sitting up here, the three of us.
Yeah, but I was expecting a different audience. This is a betrayal. I mean,
no, we have la crème de la crème. Okay, well. First of all, just to respond, the definition of modernity. And it's, there are many different definitions, and it's true that I really ought to have said quite a bit more about that in defining it. And, articles often become the preludes to larger pieces, and this is actually meant to be something like that. But there are many different definitions of modernity, and there's the sociological functional definition, which has some of the things that Federica mentioned. In other words, religion is a lifestyle choice. It is not an inescapable lifetime dictate. There is a belief in science, not in spirits. Government is sanctioned by human beings, not deities. These are aspects of modernity. Something which I haven't talked about, which is also part of it, is mass-produced goods from fossil fuel-driven factories, not craft goods from organic energy. Okay, which, by the way, is the Gandhian idea was to go back to that. And the Nehruvian idea was, no, we have to, and he used the term modernize and have factories. In many definitions, actually, you have a tripartite construction, which includes technology, culture, and, I forgot what the third one. What? Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, and technology, culture, and social change. Which I should think of. And the social change actually is very important, because again, when you talk about these all-encompassing ideas that Yinji have, I mean, the most obvious one, of course, is the Marxist idea, which posited certain situations for all society. Yes, it is passé. It is passé. But for Marxists, modernity was marked by the fall of feudalism, of feudal lords, which gave way to a bourgeoisie. Serfs gave way to wage-earning production. And for many people, okay, this marks modernity. And, it's passé, but there are some countries in which it is still studied. Federica, I think, was quite right in saying that there are many societies today that, by certain measures, would not be considered modern. Many societies in the Middle East still have Sharia law and basically are rooted in religious sanction for the government, yet they are technologically advanced. So they have technology, but they still have this idea that religion must be the arbiter of things. And I assume that within the Tibetan society there are some people who also would say that no, religion must be the ultimate arbiter. There's something interesting, and I'm sort of going all over the place with these comments because they've really stimulated me, and I've taken a lot of notes on them. But Robbie mentioned Gendin Chumpel. And in some ways, there's something about modernity in the end, or modernist thinking, which I think he comes the closest to, which is the idea. And this is what happens in many societies confronted with the crisis. The idea. And of course, the 19th century, with this colonialism, the great divergence between Europe and Asia, within that crisis atmosphere, which you find in many places of the world, the modern reaction, if I may say so, is to say we have to find a new way. The old ways don't work. The conservative reaction is to say we must go back to tradition. All of this is happening because we are losing our traditions. And I think Gendin Chumpel would have been in the first category.
I don't think so.
I think so. I think he
never marginalized Tibetan traditions.
No.
But he read them in a completely new way.
You misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying throw the traditions out. It doesn't mean throw the culture out. You can keep the culture, but you still have to find a new, if you will, revolutionary way of doing things. European culture was not thrown out with the Enlightenment. On the contrary, the study of Greek and Latin, if I may say so, became even more important as schools became standardized. So there's something different there, but it is the approach. And many societies, and you can see this in the world today, the approach is, on some of them, is to say, no, we must go back to tradition. This is fundamentalism. This is fundamentalism, as opposed to the other response, which is we must find something new. Now, again, I'm not making value judgments because, some of the things that people have found to be new included Stalinism, and in fact, again, just not to make value judgments, in the early part of the 20th century, for many people in Europe, it seemed clear that there were only two ways to advance to the future. One was, Marxism or communism, and the other was fascism. These were both seen as modern, as very modern. So again, I'm not making value judgments here. I'm just talking about a response, but they're not the only response. Okay, these are not the only response, and we can see what has happened here. Trade, I do say indeed that the outside world is coming into Tibet. And when I talk about Miwang Pola's biography, if I can digress, to this business of trade, I'm not saying, and I do mention the Situ Kachem as an example of secular biography previously, but coming at the time that it comes, this massive literary monument, which, and Miwang Pola, it's very interesting in the I'll paraphrase, but in the colophon, where the author talks about the text, he says, and Miwang Pola told me, I want idiots, I want dull people to be able to understand this. He really wanted a text that extolled him not just to the literati, but to everybody. And if I may say so, this is still an issue in Tibetan society. You really, and you know, I think that there really isn't a kind of, you know, written pelge that, by which you can write novels and novelistic conversations. There still is that literary touch to it, which one project which with some friends of mine have discussed is the need to translate modern literature into Tibetan, that this would have an impact on a Tibetan sense of modernity. And one of the problems with that is how to do it. A friend of mine attempted Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And for those of you who know literary history, you know what Kerouac tried to do was to put bebop jazz into prose. This is a big deal. And he put a short section of that up on Kapta, and one of the comments was, "This is not Tibetan. This is, you know, in Tibetan translation." So you still have issues like.
Elliot, but that's when we work on Tibetan sources,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes we reach some passages that we need to keep in Tibetan because we have no way of translating into another language. Translations are always betrayals. So I think that translating Jack Kerouac into Tibetan jazz needs to say where it is.
Yeah. Meaning what? That we shouldn't translate Jack Kerouac?
No, I mean to say that certain passages in sources cannot be translated, that they have to stay in the original language.
Of course, once you translate.
Same thing with Tibetan passages, that they have to stay in the way they are because there is no correspondent way of putting them into another language.
But Jack Kerouac
Yeah.
has been translated in every other language.
Yeah, but
so
Tibetan
why
maybe, you know, not every language is the same. It's not
Okay.
exactly same.
See, this was my idea all along, get these two to argue with each other so I could just, But the fact is, you know, Federica's right, it's been translated into other languages, and it's not a literary exercise.
This doesn't mean that it's translated well.
No, every translation is, you're quite correct, a betrayal, but a necessary betrayal if we're going to live in this world together. I'm sorry, and this is, okay, this is one of my.
It's not that I'm saying that it should not be translated.
Yeah, this is one of my, I promise you I'll get back to the subject at hand in a minute. But this is one of the, you know, this is one of my issues with, you talked about housewives doing Dharma on the weekend or something like that. You know, you have people who don't read Tibetan, but they'll read maybe a book by Jeffrey Hopkins or Bob Thurman, and then they'll present themselves as experts on Dharma. And of course, something so deeply spiritual, so deep to the person, if you're really, really serious about it, especially teaching, and you have people who are teaching Tibetan Buddhism who can't read, you know, a word, they're illiterate in it as far as it goes. Yeah, that of course, you know, you absolutely need to know the original language, but literature is something different. Literature is something different. It's spread all over, and I think the sense, the ideas inherent in modern novels. I mean, I won't get into it here, but I also said just translate Tropic of Cancer into Tibetan. You know, modernity in literature should be made accessible to Tibetans. It's not that Tibetans don't read these things. They do, but they read them in English and they read them in Chinese, because Tibetans who are educated in the People's Republic of China, in the Chinese language, many of them have access to a vast store of international, not just English, international literature. And so I think that it is really a shame.
Yeah.
I mean, more than a shame, but I don't want to get, that you don't have, access to this in Tibetan. When I think of some of the things which are.
One should try to read in the original language as much as possible.
Of course, so I'm going to read War and Peace in Russian. I'm going to.
But I mean to say that most Tibetans.
I would love to. I actually had a year of Russian.
No English. They can read English literature and buy it.
Yeah, no, but to make things accessible to the larger community. This is part of it. The vernacularization, just like secularization, vernacularization where people are writing. And mind you, this is not something that, happened ages and ages ago elsewhere. At the beginning of the 20th century in China, you have the Baihua Yundong people say, it's ridiculous. Everything's in classical Chinese. Ordinary people can't read these things. The possibility of, writing in Tibetan the way, that people speak. this is part of vernacularization. But let me get back to these different ideas that we talked about. And by the way, I hope you hear that this has really stimulated me. I mean, I'm so happy that these two friends of mine were able to read it so carefully. You didn't read it?
Of course I read it.
But the business of trade, when all these things that I talk about in terms of, Polanyi as a secular figure, the Miwang Tokchö as this massive literary monument for him, the appearance, and again, it's very interesting that it's in one person, but things have to start everywhere, somewhere, that you have a novel by Dokar Shaptung Tsering Wangyo, that you have his autobiography as well. It's the context in which it happens, and this context happens with, as I say, the world pouring in, and trade is different. You cannot compare medieval trade or the trade of antiquity with the trade which you have now, because the trade, and this is post-Columbian, post-1492, is a trade that brings the world in. You did not before have this sort of trade taking in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The capture of raw materials, which are then processed and sold over. It is a completely different kind of trade. And this trade affects the world. In the 1750s, you have the First World War. Yeah, I know. I'm not become senile yet. Effectively, and the war, has different names. In the United States, it's the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's the 7 Years' War. But it is for the first time that you have two antagonists fighting all over the globe. It's not like the Mongol conquest where you have one power which is just rolling over and rolling over. Here you have French and England, and they battle in Europe. They're also battling in North America. And, as you may know, they fought in India. The Battle of Plassey. This is something which is really unprecedented. And part of it, if you remember what I quoted from Bogle, the idea was that Britain wanted to displace France in the trade between India and Tibet. That French broadcloth is going into Tibet, it should be British broadcloth. All of this is a completely different kind of world than what you had before. And so when I say that this world brings with it, all of a sudden, how shall I say, changes in the soil. The ground is being changed. Yeah, it is colonialism, but it's something which is quite different. Again, I'm not talking in terms of values, but what you wind up with, the colonialism is also tied with technology. Which, and again, this is an element of modernity that really starts in England, with the discovery of coal so close to the surface, so easily transported. All of a sudden you have, for making iron, okay, talk about iron. It takes, for 10,000 tons of iron, you need 100,000 acres of woodland. The discovery of coal changes all that. And it begins to radicalize the relations all around the world. At the beginning of the 18th century, I don't think any Englishman could have imagined that the Mughal emperor would have to consult with the British about what he was doing. By the end of the 18th century, indeed. Now, again, I'm not putting a value judgment on this. I'm saying this is the way it was. I'm not saying, oh, this is good, this is bad. Well, obviously, I'm not a colonialist, okay? I'm not advocating colonialism. But this is how the world develops. And when we talk about modernity,
Is this a real development? You're talking slave trade, colonialism?
it is a development. You're saying, is it an advance? It is a moral advance?
By other people?
It is not a moral advance. It is not a moral advance, but unfortunately...
modernity, it doesn't touch the soul of the people.
Robbie, you'd be surprised. Who uses the internet here? Anybody? 3 people use the internet? Do you use the internet? The internet was developed for military purposes. So much of what we have materially starts with, military uses. Should we make a value judgment on that? Yes or no? The internet we have for military purposes. Again, fascism, communism, these were considered modern. I should underline, by modern, I don't mean good. I don't mean bad. I'm trying to be dispassionate in looking at this.
Every period, and we didn't speak about periodization, every period brings about some form of innovation. You call it modernity, I call it innovation. This is the nature, human nature. There are certain distinctive features coming to the point, Elliot. So you were pointing out what happened during the 18th century, this and that. That's fine with me, but it's just innovations of the time. This doesn't mean anything else.
It changed the world in which we
It
live in.
changed the world because it's closer to us.
I mean, look,
But we have to assess what the ancient changes has changed our world immensely, and we don't even realize anymore, you see. We have to have an historical perspective. We cannot only look behind, just beyond our shoulder, but maybe we have to have a longer term perspective and looking at things and the way civilization developed.
let me just say, look,
There were massive advancements in antiquity, which should be considered milestones for civilization. And I don't see why we should consider slave trade, colonialism, or pushing one's goods at the expenses of others as something necessarily modern.
because
This
it
has
is,
been done forever, you see. In the history of civilization, we have people who have been subjugating others, especially for the reasons of trade, for reasons of getting advantage of the situation. I mean, we have plenty of these situations. It's nothing new at the time. It's
Yes.
the old story.
I'm talking about what laid the foundations for the modern world. Look, I would much prefer that World War II had not happened, but it changed the world. And if you're an historian, you have to say the world changed because of this. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not saying good, okay?
It's
I'm
not a matter of good. I think it is natural in the development of civilization. We always had wars. We always had people suppressing others. So this is not new to me. No, it's history full of these events, you see. And of course, in the 18th century, same kind of events are also happening.
And it
It's
made the modern world. This is all that I'm saying. It made the modern.
I just want to say, I think that one of the reasons why you're still discussing is because you haven't agreed on a definition of modern. If you look at societies and you look at where they have those four atoms separated, then you can tell, are they modern or not? And I think that you can say, for example, that at the moment, Tibet, either in exile or occupied Tibet, is not modern because it doesn't have enough separation between religion and politics. And I perfectly agree, for example, with all of your suggestions, Roberto. But I think that you can have sort of a standard that you can apply, and it doesn't mean that it's good or that it's bad, but that you can begin to judge all societies. And just one thing I want to say. Also, Gendun Champel, I perfectly agree. He's much more of an example of a modern person than Miwang Polanyi. I think modernity has a lot to do with individualism. And Gendun Champel and also Ugyempa were quite different than the rest of the society. It doesn't mean that you don't respect tradition, but it means that you have the courage to follow your own way. And I think Gendun Champel was that. But if we're looking at a modern society, one thing is a modern individual, and one thing is a modern society. And I think we can agree that Gendun Champel was a modern individual, but the society in which he was placed was not modern yet. And as a consequence, his example sort of lives and dies with him, unfortunately.
That's why I said coming from the past and walking.
Again, we have to think. He is labeled or called Truptops. Truptops do not, stay. I mean, Truptops do not care. So if he was invited to Mongol 5 times and he didn't give a hoot about the invitation, that's because he's a Truptop. He's not a politician. He's not a businessman.
So
there should be difference between Gendu Chembe and Truptop Ujjain.
yeah, but it's the same position of not bowing down to the situations they were part of, coming with an independent viewpoint and an independent practice. And if I may say, I agree with you, but the point is that Gadem Potran brought a system of governance which was everything but modern. That's the problem, you see. So we step back. You see, in Tibet, in my view, as I said, for centuries we had separation between secularism and religion, in a minor way, of course, but we had, principalities ruled by the people, and even within the monasteries, there were people doing different jobs, different roles. But then, in my view, in Gandhi, it became a theocracy, just another theocracy, like many others in the world. So to me, it's not a step forward towards modernity or modern time, but it's a step back towards the Middle Ages.
And that's why is an exception.
Just Miwan Prane is. Yeah.
He didn't get his, like Tupchen of Gimpa, didn't get his monastery burned down. He didn't, resist being kidnapped by the Mongol warriors. He stood by himself with his own views against the ruler.
Yeah, no, I've been reminded by one of our hosts that indeed we don't have an unlimited time here. And again, I apologize, for the lateness, but I'm really happy that we're having a lively discussion. But I want to bring, if I may now, I want to bring, in the time that we have remaining, bring the audience into it. So please, yes.
We've talked a lot about how other influences, cultural influences from outside influence Tibet. But one of the things that interests me is how the Tibetan diaspora has influenced the rest of the world. And I think this is of considerable significance when you see the spread of Tibetan Buddhism across the planet. I mean, there isn't a single city or town anywhere in the developed world and the Pacific Ring and South America that doesn't have at least one Tibetan Buddhist center. And I wondered if you would care to comment on that, Dr. Sperling.
I think it's fairly deceptive because it's still a minority taste, and many Tibetans seem to think that Buddhism is about to conquer the West, and it's not. It is a minority taste. I mean, I know many Tibetans who think the United States is about to turn Buddhist. I've known some. I think now they've been disabused of that, but I knew some who thought that, oh yes, and after it becomes Buddhist, then Tibet will be free, because they'll all be Tibetan Buddhists. And
That's an exaggeration.
no, but I've heard that in years gone by. I don't think I would hear it now. But again, it's a minority thing. But yes, it is growing. It is growing. What is of particular interest for me, and this might be somewhat different, is that you had the Buddhism of what was considered a modern country, but nevertheless traditionally conservative, but still modern, Japan. In the early 20th century and in through, if you read the Beat generation novels, Zen Buddhism was the Buddhism, aside from heritage Buddhism, that is Asian communities that practiced their own form of Buddhism, but Zen Buddhism was the form of Buddhism that was attracting Westerners. Again, it was a small minority, and it's sort of been steamrolled by Tibetan Buddhism. And I mean, I don't have an answer for you about that, but, by the same token, Tibetan Buddhism has become popular with a minority. I always have to stress, with a minority in the People's Republic of China. But the other thing which you need to ask is, how is it understood? And I would be willing to say that your average Yinji Buddhist does not understand his Buddhism or her Buddhism the same way a Tibetan Buddhist does. And there's a big, big, big gap in there. In China, Tibetan Buddhism is seen as a way to get wealthy and to have male children. I mean, this is the vulgar form. This is the vulgar form. But when people talk about this, they're often talking about things which are, which in the end are quite vulgar. I could also do a little thing about the Buddhist understanding of Western science, but I will hold my tongue.
I just wanted to put in a good word for the housewives. However, their understanding of Tibetan Buddhism may be corrupted. I think they have every right to.
It's not their fault.
No,
It's the
exactly.
way it is called.
I just feel bad, because they're housewives. So, but another thing I wanted to tell you about Tibetan diaspora, what it has done for the rest of the world. I think that the awareness of Tibet as an occupied country is much more popular now than it used to be 30 years ago, I think.
Isn't that largely due to the presence of these Tibetan Buddhist centres in all these countries
I don't know
around
if
the
it is
world?
largely, I think you could
I think
a lot more
majority
because
to
of the
Yeah.
Nobel Prize to the Dalai Lama, that was
Yes,
big,
certainly
was
it did.
the first
But,
big push.
Yeah, in England we have a kind of definition. Either you're a Tib or you're a Bud, or you're a Tib Bud. Yeah?
Oh, I see.
And people who go to Dharma centres can also be very political. And then there are also people in Dharma centres who don't give two hoots about Tibetan politics and liberation. They're interested in their own personal development. But I do think that that has had a profound influence across the world. I really do. I think it's primarily Tibetan Buddhism which has raised the profile alongside the Dalai Lama's influence and the power of his transmission that has actually made a difference in the level of awareness that there is about it.
I think you're exactly touching the main issue these days. If I see the way Tibetans think about themselves, I see a polarization. On the one hand, I see Dharma. On the other hand, I see politics. In between, there is a crater, and this crater is not filled, and this should be filled with the Tibetan traditions, the knowledge of their history, of their many expressions, which is completely neglected. And very few Tibetans in exile, very few Tibetans are caring about this. And of course, there is a bigger number in occupied Tibet, despite the restrictions to research and independent thinking. So I feel that this is a big lacuna which needs to be filled. Fine with Buddhism, fine with politics. There is something more to Tibet.
Okay, I'll hold off. I think really yes.
If the 18th century Miwang Polani didn't represent the aspects of modernity, what about a 17th century work? Sorry, I don't remember the physician name, which is the work is done by Janet Gyatso. Talks about the 5th Dalai Lama's court physicians who actually practice a non-dogmatic, empiricist medical practice, so medical empiricism. So, I mean, those were being practiced in 17th century Tibet. So what about those? I just wanted to hear your comment on it. A court physician in 5th Dalai Lama's court who...
No. But what about him?
So the argument by Janet Gyatso is that it represents an aspect of modernity because it has a non-dogmatic, empiricist medical practices. So just your view on it, if... Thank you.
Yeah, okay, that might very well be the case. I haven't studied Tibetan medicine. I haven't studied Tibetan medical practice. Empiricism in and of itself, you have that, again, one could go back to the Greeks, in terms of logic, and one can even go back to Buddhist logic and debate about empiricism. But the point that I'm making about the Miwang Tokje is its appearance at a given time in a given milieu with regard to what was happening. Tibet was a part of a Manchu-Mongol order. Many historians speak about this period as early modernity for China, but what they really mean is, for the Manchu Empire, in that sense, because China was under the Manchus. And so I see this conjunction. It is a conjunction of things which I think is important here. Empiricism and medical practice, I think that's almost a given. I mean, if you don't get cured, if it doesn't work, I think it gets to be obvious, rather than simply saying do this because it's dogmatic. Yeah.
This is Rinzin. I'm from Tibet Policy Institute. So I want to say I'll agree with the definition of the modernity given by Professor Dr. Robert, because I don't believe in the one definition of modernity. And second thing is, I think all three of you have looked at the modernity of Tibet in a very broad concept. I think we have to narrow down the Tibetan society or civilization into a different fragmentation, like the modernity in terms of political institution, economic, social, or like that. I myself, as a political science student, I am more interested in political institutions in terms of modernity. If we suppose look in the eye from the Euro or Western-centric definition of modernity, I think the modern political institution of Tibet has started from the 5th Dalai Lama, when he started the Kande Photang institutions, and followed by the 7th Dalai Lama, who has introduced the Kashak. So I invite some of your, three of you, to give some insight on that.
I'm not certain. Are you saying that you find Ganden Pojang to be modernist? Is this what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of political institutions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
as a political institution.
Well, I think Robbie already said what he thinks, that the Ganden Podrang is actually worse than what you had before, because before you had some sort of separation between secular and religious, and then instead the Ganden Podrang put secular and religion together with the Chesis and Drel, so in a sense was sort of a step back. And it's so
Also pluralism, that's what I would define it, loss of pluralism. One voice.
When I say the Eurocentric definition of modernity, I want to add the element of the definition of democratic institutions. So the Kande Photang has started some kind of democratic institutions in the Tibetan history. Am I right? I may be wrong. Thank you.
When this? When?
I see what he's saying.
Ganden Podrang
I see what he's
started.
saying.
No,
That
I mean,
Since the very
some sort of
outset.
Parliament.
the
Since the very outset, you mean to this
yes,
is
at the advent of the
Great
Kande
Field.
Photang institutions, I think could be the starting of the.
You should read what Tashila's short piece he wrote some years ago, and then we can talk about it, one of these days.
Thank you.
Read that,
Sure.
then you will see.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing. First of all, just to be clear, I was not saying that Tibet is modern. I'm saying that you have harbingers. The ground seems to be prepared for history, had it gone in another direction, being modern. That's number one. Number two, with regard to Ganden Pojang, I think most people here, I don't know if they have, but most people have probably read Dung Harlo Sangchenle's Chusi Sungja Kuar Shepa, and he takes a very, if I may say, Eurocentric definition. He basically uses Hegel and Marx as his guides, and he sees Ganden Pojang really as the apogee of this non-modern, in fact, non-modern Tibet, and in fact the point at which the system basically collapses of its own contradictions. And he stops, of course, in 1950 because he doesn't want to say what really caused everything to collapse. But Ganden Pojang basically, I don't think one would say that it was democratic. The landholding system, for those engaged in sociological or even Marxist ideas, the landholding system remained unchanged. And this is certainly not modern. Having said that, I should also say, and I've said this before, that the condition of Tibetan quote-unquote serfs or bound peasants actually compared favorably with those of Chinese peasants during the Cultural Revolution, and even with peasants in the subcontinent under the zamindari system, which you had in India and which persisted in Pakistan. But that's part of a value judgment. I would not consider it modern, and even the question of democracy, I don't want to open a can of worms here, but there are a lot of questions one could ask about democracy that is practiced here, which has been...
Do you see any democracy anywhere in the world?
I'll just say there was a congressman who wrote a letter about Tibetan democracy. Yeah, okay, please.
So it's interesting to hear the different definitions of modernity. It's a new topic to me. So I'm wondering why there's the emphasis in the separation of religion and secular world in the definition of modernity. And so can a culture not be modern without that separation?
Yeah, I would say that the separation between religion and politics is a given, is something that needs to be that needs to be there for modernity to be achieved in a society. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a religion, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be political, but it means that religion shouldn't influence politics and vice versa. So, you know, if I think of a country, say like Iran or even North Korea, you know, North Korea is not a religious country, but the ideology is so strong that it works as a religion, and that if you don't think in that particular way, you are punished. And the same goes for Iran. If you don't think in the particular way that is set up by the Khamenei and the religious leaders, then you are an outcast. And so that creates a problem of freedom. And I think freedom is also at the base of all of this.
Yeah, I should add that the separation of religion and politics should not be understood as the suppression of religion. It means that religion is an individual choice. It's not mandated by the state, and there are no religious obligations imposed upon people. It's their individual choice. And indeed, it also means the protection of the right to people to practice religion. You know, freedom of religion. You know, the United States and the Constitution basically mandates the separation of church and state. And, you know, people like Jefferson and even other early thinkers were, you know, quite, shall I say, atheistic in their beliefs. And the United States today is probably the most religious of the Western democracies, just in terms of general popular sentiment.
I think part of independent thinking and openness is also to accept every religion for what it is. I mean, he says, she said, maybe the misuse of religion is not recommended, but in the contribution the religion has given to Tibetan culture is enormous. If one sees it with open eyes, with no biases and all, I think religion is extremely important because there's very much to say in many, many respects. So I wouldn't demonize religion and think that they cannot go hand in hand, you see. I mean, there should be a wise understanding and a good use of it, you see, and then there is nothing wrong, you see. But if religion is another domination, you see, then it's a problem.
Yeah, we're really running short of time, so we have to limit it to 2 questions. I have one over here and one over here. You don't have the microphone, do you? Yeah, okay, you have the mic, so go.
Thank you. I think we cannot think modernity in terms of universal concept that we should agree or not on a definition. We can only understand it as a historical product of Europe or Western societies. And that's why her question is interesting, because since modernity is a historical product from, I mean, European societies, we cannot think independently from this social context where it's emerged. And to think that what is modern in Tibet and other societies is just to apply one Western concept that is historically product on other society, and we will never find anything that is really modern in Tibet. We will only find things in Tibet which looks like what we think is modern in Europe or in Western societies. And to see also with this as a historical product, you say that maybe colonialism is a product of modernity, but we can say the other way around, and maybe modernity is a product of colonialism. It was at least a tool that helps colonial power to legitimize their colonial enterprise and to settle their power on other countries. That leads also to the question you say modernity is separation between religions and politics. But the concept of religions is also a product of modernity, of European modernity. So after we go in another country and say, this is religion, so it should be separated from politics. And if it's really the separation between politics and religion that makes modernity, what about England, where the Queen is the head of state and also the chief of the Anglican Church? So England is not a modern state. No, okay, but I mean,
Yeah,
is in West religion and politics really separated? Maybe the institutions are, but
I think just very, very briefly, I think that we can agree that the degrees of in which these four components that Federica mentioned are, equally present in all societies, I think is debatable, and we can say that, there.
It has nothing to do
Yeah.
with Europe.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
point is that you can apply that separation to every society. It doesn't matter how you do it. As long as you separate those four atoms, I don't care how you do it, that's when you're entered, the society has entered
Yeah.
into other. So I'm trying to find sort of an objective
What?
way so that you can judge non-European cultures. Otherwise, I could have said, if I had said that modernity is industrialism and science and technology, that's very European. But if you take society as something separated from economy, it doesn't matter which kind of society, it doesn't matter which kind of economy. Politics separated from religion, it doesn't matter which politics, which religion. Then you have that sort of tension, and you can apply it, I think, to any culture.
Where has this arisen apart from the influence of Western culture? Like in history, where have these four separated, like you're saying, to be modern without the influence?
Well, the first country where it actually occurred was England. The first country where it
Give me an example where it didn't come from the influence of Western culture.
I'm not sure I've understood your question, sorry.
Is there a non-Western example?
Like Japan. Japan did it in the 1870s.
Our final question.
I would just like to know your views about what we talked about before, what you talked about before about the Western-centric concept of literary. The Western-centric concept of literary modernity as we know it. It is not accessible to us in Tibetan language, and the lack of vernacularization of the literary language. So as a Tibetan, I know that Tibetan language was kind of hard for me to read and study because of the lack of accessibility. And I would just like to know your thoughts on it, because, and it seems that it seems to be a reflection of our reaction to the crisis atmosphere after coming into exile, and we seem to be going backwards instead of moving like according to our environment, and this seems to be an obstacle to preserving the Tibetan language for me. So I would just like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, very briefly, I mentioned before that one of the reactions, to the crises of the 19th and 20th century, all across the world, one of the reactions was that, what we're doing doesn't work. It was earlier in Europe, but it was the same, revolution, that there must be a different way. The old ways don't work. And it doesn't mean a wholesale discarding of culture, but on some important levels, this is extremely important. And the reaction, of course, is that, what's going wrong is that we're not adhering to tradition. We should go back to the traditional ways. And you're absolutely right. After Tibetans first came into exile, Jamyang Norbo actually wrote a very interesting article many, many years ago, and he said, we were so excited. All of a sudden, people were saying, just like the Chinese in the May 4th movement, we must turn to Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. And people wanted to explore all of these things, and the idea was that, what had existed before didn't work. And for a lot of young Tibetans, there was this idea. Now, of course, that's not all that there was. The fact is that, China invaded Tibet. Things didn't collapse, on their own. But many Tibetans were saying, how could this have happened to us? And again, the question of modernity came up. But, to be quite honest, there's been a regression. There really has been a regression. Not so much I don't want to get into too much trouble here, but there was a time early on, as somebody who does Tibetan studies, where, the place where Tibetan studies was, really, being taken seriously was here. I mean, you also had the Namgyal Institute, but it was really here in Durham, here at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives with their publications. And things have really regressed. And now, to be quite honest, there's an idea that Tibetan studies is just Buddhism. Buddhism is Tibetan studies. This really is going backwards. I mean, some of the major institutions are now, basically monastically led or influenced, whereas in the People's Republic of China, and I think this is, something that you should really question yourselves about, but the Tibetan studies, Tibetological research being done there is very cutting edge in many ways. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of junk too. But you'll find a lot of stuff that actually is very important. And I don't mean just the republication of old text, which is important in and of itself, giving us access to it, but the study of it, the things that are being done. So much so that, I find that there's an awful lot published in the Chinese language that is extremely important for Tibetan studies. Most of the, not most, but a large number of historical texts are translated into Chinese. I think Chinese is now the premier language for the, it's the language in which you have the most translations of historical texts, certainly, from Tibetan into another language. And I think, you should, maybe ask the question. Even if I may say so, the thing that some people point to as, this is very modern, the Buddhism in science agenda. Yeah, I guess I was going to get there. Federica, my former student, says, you were going to get there eventually. It's not being undertaken really with a scientific frame of mind. The whole thing is being undertaken to validate Buddhism, to show that it's in accord with science. There's no blank slate there. And you're basically dealing with science, which, has its falsifiabilities, and Buddhism, which is doctrine. There's no reason why the two couldn't coexist, but they're not the same thing. And, one is on the religious plane and one is on the science plane. And the other part of it, scientifically, you have people expounding upon science without reading scientific literature. In other words, a lot of what you have comes down to junior high school science or high school science. If you really want to begin to explore these things, you need people who are trained, mathematically, in physics, and I mean at the graduate level, beyond the graduate level, the research institute level. Otherwise, then you wind up with the equivalent of these people who claim to know all about Tibetan Buddhism from having read, a book by Jeffrey Hopkins and a book by Bob Thurman, and maybe taken an undergraduate class in Asian civilization. And there are a lot of those. I guess on that dismal note, I'm going to close except for one
Final word from Tashi.
After Shunudame Tamgyu, we have, at the same time, Shunudame Tamgyu, Dingjen Tsiriwangji, he wrote another novel, Norsang Tokju. And then, a couple of decades later, Doring Pendita wrote almost same genre called Jebu Mujutagbe Tamgyu, which is extremely rare, which was never published. It's by Doring Pendita. Plus, like Mewang Tokje, it's a biography, but then there's an autobiography of an aristocrat who died in 1913, Shega Lingbe Tokje. He himself wrote it. So there are things like that. Then Pebadolji Henye Troson. Dengrab Sidutane Tagi Chongdang, Dimdudong, then Samlo Sabadong, Monguchikane in Dervashia Sawala. That do you get one get a shiva in Narva? When the Pebarong Tadong Honorva Lama Tigal Jave Kadu, Tindo Jave Kadu, Chansa Jave Kadu, Tindela, Dudu the Shedu, Mende Jashet Jidu, and Punsong and the Essage, your regular. Do you Punson Soba, saying the cup to do 가디나 두디 야보 샤다 세상 두산 샤다 케디요 가디나 제동 가는도 로지우타나 라만남바게 남다도 사마탄도 두 가디나 찌로 찌도 십자 납자 두자 제자 급자 받을렘나와 두데 가디나 니마가도 슬랍제와 가디나 나도 두자 임바지 두저데 까바 정데 야보 임바 가디나 것도 뒤요 말 나랑도 그 가서 우리 이사 나와다 제가 두고 거기 들으시게 신이 줘서 봤대 예 된내가 진보를 보지 통서로 봐 되니 직 다다긴 것도 예제게 총제 변화라 드럽 집드나라 용두자네 빼나 시제게 레차 그러면 두두자는 건도 그 드럽 집든 게 빼차게 놓라 드럽 집든 게 벽에 라마게 남타도 라남 나라 곱서게 레자스 큰 라비오 말 지제설 고카르슬 고카르보 pesanatan jawa ngawe ge namda tugul gosan inanda kawa tanar wala tadi chije france re jame re tene keje yuno yemare chije ji insona dege tene ta tugulo grik pena gogar gi thuk singanda bo gogar gi go singanda bo kadi nang de peje nala gogar seyor ta durem nishu nala ani derwa chiru chinzon beba chijil chin yore tene beba mombo chongbai jagal mrugu yore chitani ani jarkab ge ming got jarkab ge ming to gotu je pena italy thermas lambi yore o de tiso tindu daga shodu ge ge an daga in tu chena.
Okay, just before I close, since Tashi gave me the title of Tsokyong, so I can basically do whatever I want since I'm Tsokyong. But just one little anecdote from the very early 90s at a conference with regard to the novel, and I won't name the guilty parties, but except for myself, of course. But one person got up and said, "And now, for the first time in Tibet, somebody's written a novel," and he was talking about the book Tsukyu. So me, hero of the day, I said, Shunudame, is far earlier than that, and it has nothing to do with the Chinese presence. Somebody else answered very cynically, a Brit, well, isn't the Mille Namtar really a novel? So, which it's not. I mean something very specific by novel. But thank you so much for coming and for staying for so long. And I really have to thank Tashi for arranging this. I have to thank Robbie and Federica for agreeing to participate and for doing so with such good fellowship. And again, I hope some of the points that have been raised here germinate like sprouts of modernity. That some of them are taken up in discussion in the Tibetan community because these are ongoing issues. So thank you all so much, and I hope you don't get wet going home.